We've just been back and forth across the country several times in cars, and now our adventures are over. We're still great friends, but we have to go into later phases of our lives. So there he goes, Dean Moriarty, ragged in the moth-eaten overcoat he brought specially for the freezing temperatures of the East, walking off alone, and last I saw him, he rounded the corner of 7th Avenue, eyes on the street ahead, and bent to it again. Gone. So, in America, when the sun goes down, and I sit on the old broken down river pier watching the long, long skies over New Jersey, and sense all that raw land that rolls in one unbelievable huge bulge over to the west coast, and all that road going, and all the people dreaming in the immensity of it. In an hour I know by now that children must be crying in the land where they let the children cry. And tonight the stars will be out. And don't you know that God is Pooh Bear? The evening star must be drooping and shedding her sparkler dims on the prairie, which is just before the coming of complete night that blesses the earth, darkens all the rivers, cups the peaks, folds the final shore in. Nobody knows what's going to happen to anybody besides the forlorn rags of growing old. Think of Dean Moriarty, or even think of old Dean Moriarty, the father we never found. Think of Dean Moriarty, I think of Dean Moriarty.
All right, thanks for joining us on another episode of Why Not Go. For any Jack Kerouac fans, this home is where he lived for quite a few months and at a very pivotal time in his career. There's two houses in this area where he lived. One is actually called the Kerouac house, and we'll go to that one after this one. But at this house, it's 1219 Yates Street in the College Park area, he hardly any people talk about this house, and I'm not sure I've ever seen it documented on YouTube or any other channel. But he lived here with his sister Caroline, her husband Paul Blake, their 8-year-old son Paul Jr., and his mother. I don't know if his sister and her husband were renters or if they owned the house. I think they were renters. And he moved here in December of 1956. He was 34 years old, and this was quite a few months before On the Road was published. But he knew it was going to be published. He moved here, as I said, right around Christmas time, 1956, and I believe his mother was already here with his sister and her husband and her son, and he had already published The Town and the City. That had already been published. That book wasn't super successful. I mean, I think it did moderately okay. So he was by no means a known writer. He was still pretty much an unknown writer, but he knew that Viking Press was going to publish On the Road in September of '57. So he obviously didn't know it was going to be as successful as it turned out to be. But one of the things that he was doing when he was here was a couple things regarding On the Road. Viking wanted to call it Anywhere Road as the title, and he insisted on the Road. So glad he insisted on that. And Viking was worried about any kind of libel cases. So when he moved here, he was working on changing the names in On the Road, because a lot of the names in On the Road were real life names. So that was what he was working on when he was here, getting On the Road ready to be published. He was working on changing the names in the book to be fictitious names so no one could get angry that they were in the book. And the other thing he was working on when he was here was the book Desolation Angels. And I'm just going to read, I'll let Joe just pan to the house. I'm just going to read a passage that was actually written in this house in the book Desolation Angels. On the porch of the house was my old roll-top desk with all its unpublished manuscripts in it, and the couch where I slept. To sit at my desk and stare was sad. all the work I'd done on it, 4 novels and innumerable dreams and poems and notes. I was working as hard as any man in the world. So what did I have to reproach myself for, privately or otherwise? So you can see at this time he was working on Desolation Angels, but he really was still he had published one book, but he was still an unknown, struggling writer. And apparently he didn't get on very well with his brother-in-law, Paul, who was a military guy, very sort of straight and narrow. And apparently he thought of Jack Kerouac as kind of a loser, an artistic guy that was just writing books that were never going to go anywhere. And so the two of them did not get along. I'm sure any creative person knows that feeling. A lot of creative people have run into people that feel that way about them, or they have members of their family that feel that way about them. So he didn't get along that well with his brother-in-law, but he did with his nephew. He used to play basketball with him, go bicycle riding around these streets with him. So it was a very pivotal time in his life. He was, as I said, he was getting ready for On the Road to be published, and he was working on Desolation Angels, and he was spending time with his mother and his sister and his nephew. So it was a very pivotal time. So I'll just let Joe handle the camera. And so he stayed here. He moved here in December of 1956, and but he was always bouncing around a lot. He didn't stay in one place too long. His girlfriend at the time in New York was a woman named Helen Weaver, and he wrote to her at this time when he was living in the house. He said, "Though I'm supposed to be a lazy bum, I haven't done anything for the last 12 days but rattle on this typewriter day and night." In mid-January, he went to New York to try to drum up more interest in his other books. They were at Viking Press. They were ready to publish On the Road that year, but he was trying to drum up also some interest in his other books. But he got so drunk in those few days in New York that Helen Weaver kicked him out. And then after that, his next girlfriend was Joyce Johnson, who I believe was introduced to him by another poet. In March of '57, he left for Tangiers to meet up with William Burroughs, and then he went to France after that. So he did a lot of traveling in early '57. And then in April, though, he returned to this house, 1219 Yates. So this was really his home, even though he bounced around, went to New York, went to Tangiers, went to France. This was his home. This is where his belongings were. This is where his mother was. He was very close to his mother. And then so moving on into 1957, he decided to go and meet up with his friend Neil Cassidy in California. And so he wanted to take his mother with him. I guess she wanted to go. So they traveled by Greyhound bus all the way to San Francisco. They went to, he headed to Berkeley, right outside San Francisco. And again, in Desolation Angels, the book he was working on when he was in this house, he writes the following: "It's hot in May in Florida. I long to get out and go west beyond the East Texas plain to that high plateau and on over the divide to dry Arizonas and beyond. Poor Ma is standing there absolutely dependent on me." So that was what he wrote in Desolation Angels right around this time. But they only stayed in Berkeley for a very short time. Apparently it was kind of a disastrous trip. His mother didn't like being so far away from her grandchild and her daughter here in this house, and she wanted to come back to Florida. So I think they only stayed in California for just a few days, and then in June of '57, they came back here, but he knew he wanted to get his mother, he wanted to live in his own place with his mother, and so he ended up renting, or his mother ended up renting an apartment very close to here, and that's where we're going to go next. So this is the second house that Jack Kerouac lived in this College Park area of Orlando. And the first thing you notice when you come up to this house is this beautiful oak tree. It's just glorious. And there's a very famous picture of Jack Kerouac standing by this oak tree, which we'll show you in just a minute. So that's the Kerouac house there, 1418 Clouser Street. And this is the famous picture of Jack Kerouac standing in front of that beautiful oak tree. I'm so glad it's still there. So Kerouac and his mother moved here in July of 1957, and as I said, it's just a couple blocks away from the house we just showed you on Yates Street. So this appealed to him and his mother because they could be close to his sister and his nephew, but they could still have their own space. So this house was actually saved from demolition in 1998. It was going to be demolished, but a local journalist by the name of Bob Keeling discovered that Kerouac had lived here in a very important time in his life, and he also wrote Dharma Bums here. And so the house was saved from demolition, and it was also converted into a historical landmark, and it's called the Kerouac Project. And I believe they choose 4 writers a year to stay in the house, and each writer gets about, I think, 3 months to live here rent-free, and they have events here. So it's really nice how the house lives on and serves writers in the way that it does. So a lot of people think that Kerouac and his mother lived in the whole house. They didn't. They just lived in this tiny converted back porch in the back. Most of it was just a converted screened-in porch. And that's a famous picture there of Jack Kerouac with some oranges. He loved to just pluck oranges from the tree in the back. So he and his mother lived in a very small space. We'll show you the interior in a minute. The rent was $45 a month. His mother got, I believe, $200 a month from Social Security. So it was a perfect fit for them. They could be close to Caroline and her son, but they could still have their own space. And but it was a very small apartment. It's basically just an open room, kind of must have had a little kitchenette in there, and then a small bedroom and a bathroom. So not a big space at all. I would say it was probably only about 700 square feet. So after Kerouac moved here in July of 1957, he took off right away to Mexico City. He wrote to Allen Ginsberg at the time, saying that he called Florida a heat wave horror, which is funny. And he announced that he was going to the cool plateau of Mexico City to work on Dr. Sachs. the book he was working on at the time. But he only stayed about 3 weeks because he got really sick in Mexico City, and then he came back here. And when he arrived back here, his mother was gone, and he didn't have a key to get in, so he had to sleep right there on the ground. I also read that he liked to sleep outside a lot here, and sometimes he'd just take a sleeping bag and sleep outside when the nights were cool enough. So this house is really significant for many reasons, but one of the main ones is that Kerouac wrote the novel The Dharma Bums here, and that's a picture of him inside the house. He used the same kind of scroll paper that he used on the road to write Dharma Bums. He wrote Dharma Bums in, I believe, just 12 days in December, early December 1957. And he wrote the entire novel in 12 days in this house. And On the Road had just been published prior to Dharma Bums. It was published in September of 1957. He was in New York. He wasn't in the house during that month because he wanted to be in New York when On the Road was published. So this is a picture that I took because a writer had let us into the house a few years ago. And you can see it's just it's a small space. To the right is the bedroom there where you see the hardwood floors. That's a picture of us in the bedroom. It was a small bedroom. I don't know if his mother slept there and he slept in the living room area, or if they both had twin beds in the bedroom. You can see it's decorated really in a cute 1950s style. The Kerouac Project does a really good job to kind of keep the vintage feel in the house. That's another view of the main living room area. Maybe he wrote in that little alcove there where you see the desk. But yeah, it's just a converted screen porch with a couple little room additions. That's a nice, some nice old typewriter there that they have in the house. So Kerouac and his mother lived here from July 1957 until April of 1958. And it was really important time in his life, obviously, because On the Road was published in September of 1957, and his life changed completely after that. He went from being a penniless writer to being very successful in a short period of time. There's those famous steps there and their front door. It's really a sweet little house. But because I think Kerouac was always traveling, going back and forth to New York or Mexico City, I guess his mother had her own space there, her own solitude. So you can see the side of the house where you see that window pane with the 4 squares. That's where the bedroom was, and I think that window in the middle was the bathroom. So small space, little backyard, little side yard there. And I don't know who lived in the main part of the house, but it wasn't them. They just had a small little tiny apartment in the back. And there's that beautiful oak tree, which is so nice. And there's the front of the house with a nice patio. So this was a very important time in his life. He went from being an unknown writer to being a very, very famous, successful writer when he was living here on Clouser Street in the College Park area of Orlando. So that concludes our tour of the 2 houses where Jack Kerouac lived in this pivotal time of his life from December of 56 to early 1958. So he left this house on Clouser in early 1958, and he moved to Northport, New York, which is on Long Island, because at this point he had money and he bought a house and he took his mother with him. But during this time, everything changed for him, and his life was never the same, and I think literature was never the same either. right, so this is the third house that Kerouac lived in. We're at 1309 Alfred Drive in the Kingswood Manor area, and Kerouac lived here from May of 1961 to December 1962. So the last house we were in, the Kerouac house, the one that they call the Kerouac house on Clouser, he moved from there in April of 1958. So he was up in the New York area most of that time in between. And again, Kerouac, after On the Road was published, he was a very famous writer, very successful writer, so he had money. So shortly thereafter, On the Road was published, he took his mother up to Long Island and he bought a house. On the Road was not just a critical success, but it was a financial success. They even wanted to do a movie of it at the time, starring Marlon Brando, but apparently that deal didn't come through. So, but that's how famous he was. That's how successful he was. His life really turned around after On the Road was published. So he was up in Long Island for a while. He bought a house up there and he lived there with his mother. But he always, when you look at his letters, he kind of had a love-hate relationship with Florida. He didn't like the summers. I mean, who does? But he, one of the things he liked about Florida was not just so he could be near his sister and his nephew. What he liked was that he could kind of be anonymous down here. He, in New York, even on Long Island, people seemed to find his address. Even strangers would knock on his door and want to have drinks with the famous writer of On the Road. And his friends were always coming by, and sometimes he wanted them to, sometimes he didn't. So that was one of the things he didn't like about New York, and he was, and probably one of the reasons why he came back down to Florida. He bought a piece of property, a vacant land piece of property, and his idea was to build a compound for himself, his mother, and his sister and her family, kind of like a big duplex or two houses on this lot. He purchased the property. It was here in Orlando, but he never built the houses that he wanted to. Now his sister, the reason why he ended up on this street was because his sister purchased a house with her husband just 2 doors down, and we think because there's only one house that way to the curb, to the corner, we're thinking she was 2 doors down that way. So, and when she purchased the house in 1961, and shortly thereafter, she told Kerouac and his mother that there was a house available just 2 doors down. And so he snapped this house up only for that reason, because he could be so close to his sister. His mother could be back close to her grandchild. He could be near his nephew. And he liked the idea that he could be anonymous in Florida. All right, so this is another angle of the Kerouac house. The White House there. And so we know that his sister and her husband lived 2 doors down on the same side, and the house in that direction, there can't be a house 2 doors down because there's only one house and there's a curb, there's a corner. So we're pretty sure that his sister and her family would have lived in this house, 1317 Alfred. So this is probably where his sister and her husband Paul and his nephew Paul Jr., who he was still very close to during this time. He used to walk him to junior high, I believe, close by, so he was always walking around these streets in the Kingswood Manor area. So yeah, so I think that is where his sister lived, and he was in this White House right there with the 2 cars in the driveway. And I read a couple funny stories about when he lived here, and one of them was his mother wanted wall-to-wall carpeting, installed, and apparently his drinking was getting pretty severe at this point. And the carpet installer came in, and he was drunk on the couch. He didn't want to get up to move the furniture around, and he told the carpet installer, "Hey, why don't you sit with me and have some drinks?" And the guy did, and so they both ended up getting drunk all afternoon, and his mother never got the carpet that she wanted. But he loved this house. It was a really nice house at the time. It was it was a new development in 1961. And he liked, his bedroom apparently was in the back, and he installed a door so he could go directly from the bedroom out to the backyard, because he liked that. And so he moved in here in May of '61, and at that time he wrote to his agent, Sterling Lord, "It's great to get out of New York City, New York. It's already hot down here, but air conditioning sends coolness from vents in every room in the house." So he had central air in 1961, which was kind of a big deal back then, I think. So he moved in May of '61. In June of '61, he went to Mexico City for a while to work on the second half of Desolation Angeles. That's the book that he started at the first house on our tour, and so he was working on the second half of that book. But what really makes this house significant, not only is it the only house Kerouac owned in Orlando, and the house that he stayed in the longest, he was here for about a year and a half, but this is a house where he wrote Big Sur, and that's the book that's about his time in Ferlinghetti's cabin in Big Sur, someone doing yard work, and he wrote the entirety of that book at the kitchen table in this house, which is amazing. He wrote it in 10 days in early part of October 1961, and he wrote it, as I said, just in 10 days. Apparently the neighbors hardly ever saw him. They said that he used to sleep during the day and stay up and write at night. So Big Sur came out about a year later in September of 1962, and it wasn't a big success. He was kind of disappointed about that. And then around this time, for whatever reason, he wasn't getting along with his sister. The two sides of the family weren't speaking. Maybe it had something to do with the brother-in-law, who he never liked, and the brother-in-law never liked him. And also his sister's marriage was starting to unravel as well. Her husband was spending more time away from home. So for whatever reason, he moved here to be close to his sister, but by the latter part of 1962, the two sides of the family weren't speaking. And I guess he kind of had enough of that. And in December of 1962, he packed up his mother and their 3 cats, and they moved back to Long Island. So, but this was an important house for him. I think he liked the solitude. He says that in his letters. Sometimes he got lonely. In one of his letters, he was asking Ferlinghetti to visit him. He said he was lonely. He used to hang around with a couple of ex-professional baseball players, and hang out at Tinker Field, which is a baseball diamond nearby. But I think he enjoyed his time here. From what I read, he liked the quietness, and he liked being near his nephew. And but yes, as I said, for some reason he wasn't getting along with his sister. I don't know if the mother wasn't getting along with his sister either, but the family kind of, there was family tension, and he left in December of 1962. He did come back to Florida later in 1964, and that's where he died. He died in 1969 at the age of 47 in St. Petersburg. But this was the last house he lived in Orlando, the longest house he ever lived in Orlando, and the only house he owned in Orlando. So it's quite significant, I think. Okay, well, I guess that ends our tour of the Kerouac houses of Orlando, the 3 Kerouac houses of Orlando. They were all 3, I think, so important to him at that time in his life. And I think all 3 are also very important in American literature. So thanks for watching. We'll be seeing you. One more look at the Kerouac house, where Big Sur was written in just 10 days in 1961 at the kitchen table.